Hey class, it's good to be with you again. Today we're going to be talking about data gathering. So I just wanted to walk you through the slides that are in this module. So over the course of the next 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to be talking about the importance of diagnostic relationships in the OD process. You'll be able to describe the methods for diagnosing and collecting data and to understand and utilize techniques for analyzing data. So first, in relation to data gathering, I really like this quote. Without valid information, it would be difficult for the client to learn and for the interventionist to help. Valid information is that which describes the factors plus their interrelationships that create the problem for the client's system. So ultimately, that's the goal, is that we want to have valid information. This helps us work with the client on a valid fact-based diagnosis and develop a fact-based intervention to solve the problem, rather than just going by your gut or going by what you feel, or perhaps I've seen this a million times, so I just think we need to do this. Those aren't particularly useful ways in trying to actually diagnose. Additionally, data gathering helps to distinguish between the presenting problems versus the underlying problems. And that's a really big issue in OD consulting, is a lot of times organizations will tell you what their needs are, and so a consultant will come in and try to address those needs without actually digging deeper. And it's like the old analogy of the iceberg. You can only see that top 20%. That's the part that's obvious to you, but it's actually the 80% that's underneath the surface of the water that's really important. And that is the case with a lot of organizational issues and challenges. So we need to make the distinction between the technical and business problem and the organizational and personal problems, and understand how the problem is being managed. So as we go through the process, first we plan to collect the data. Then we actually have some sort of data collection method that we choose, and we collect the data, we analyze the data, we feed back the data to the client, and then we do follow-up, and it's actually a loop. So the follow-up would then loop back to planning to collect additional data, collect, analyze, feedback, and so on. And so you need to make sure that you involve the client in the process of these core activities, in the planning process as well as the core activities, and in the follow-up. I see teams sometimes miss that, and they just kind of develop their own plan, their own data collection strategy, and they'll create their own materials and instruments, surveys and whatnot, without really talking to the client. And that's a real missed opportunity, and it can cause potential problems. So let's talk for a few minutes about some of the most common data gathering techniques. We tend to talk about collecting data in terms of qualitative or quantitative data. Quantitative data being the type of data where you can analyze using statistics. You can get mean scores, you can run regressions, those sorts of things. And then you have qualitative data, where it's not numbers from a survey or some other analytical technique, but you're getting other types of information, qualitative information. So let's talk about those and break them down into these different kind of broad categories. Interviews would generally be considered qualitative research. So you can develop a set of interview questions. You go and talk to people. Those can be short interviews. They can be in-depth interviews. And ultimately, over the course of a half an hour, you can get at the root of a lot of particular issues that you're trying to understand with sometimes a relatively small number of people. You might interview just 5 to 10 people and get a wealth of information. The general rule is for interviewing that you want to interview until you start to just see a lot of repeat types of responses. So you want to feel like you hit saturation point, to where interviewing more people would really just repeat the same types of information over and over again. Once you hit that saturation point, you're usually about done. Focus groups are also generally considered qualitative research, and they're kind of similar to interviews, but instead of a one-on-one type of a setting or a two-on-two type of a setting, focus groups tend to have a larger group of people. You'll have the facilitator asking questions. You get to see the group dynamic of the people in the room and how they respond and how they interact with each other. So usually you'll have a facilitator and you'll have another person taking notes. Sometimes you'll even record, either audio or video, record the session so you can go back and see things like body language and facial impressions and different responses that people have to the types of things that you're discussing. The nice thing about focus groups is you can get more people responses from more people more quickly. Surveys, you create a survey instrument, you ask questions. Sometimes they can be open-ended, sometimes they're close-ended, where you'll even have them rate something on a scale. You can do observations, where you're actually just going in and trying to be a fly on the wall and see what you see. Observe meetings, observe interactions, observe processes, and then try to extrapolate from that. And then unobtrusive measures, these are sometimes we call the secondary data. Unobtrusive measures is where you have existing documentation within the organization. Maybe you have memos, you have meeting minutes, maybe they collect performance data on their employees already, and so they have that data available, and you can just get that from them without having to do additional research yourself. So let's talk about each of these a little bit more in depth, but those are the general categories that I would like you to consider for your own projects as you move forward throughout the rest of the semester. I'll say, okay, first, interviews. There is a distinction between confidentiality and anonymity. So confidentiality is no one will know what was said. Anonymous is no one will know who said it. So generally, we want to reassure people that the interviews are anonymous, but not necessarily confidential, because part of the purpose of doing the interviews is you want to be able to see the types of things people are saying, and then you want to be able to feed back that information to the organization, not in a way that identifies anybody, but where you can still pull out the themes and the commonalities and the issues that are raised. So I think it's important to make sure that you explain that to the client when you're preparing to do interviews, that certainly you want them to be anonymous, I think almost always. Sometimes they can be confidential, but other times it's not going to be strictly confidential, because you will share the results with the client, and you need the participants to understand that. You need to emphasize the interest in the interviewee, not just in one particular answer. So you're not fishing for a particular answer, but you're interested actually in what they have to say, even if it doesn't fit a script or some sort of preconceived notion of what you think they would say. It's generally good to interview with a partner. So one person asks the questions, one person writes notes, and you can even trade off on questions. It's really helpful to develop an interview guide where you have set questions prepared and you have instructions on how to go through the interview. But it's also important, even with structure, that you allow the conversation to flow and that you can ask follow-up questions, and you can help people feel at ease and comfortable to share. And if they're willing to share openly, then the interview can go in a lot of different directions that you didn't even prepare for, because you didn't know where it might go. You have to think about how you're going to choose those who are going to be interviewed. Is it a census approach, meaning you want to interview everybody? Maybe you're interviewing everyone within a division or within a department. And maybe there's 10 people in the department, so you just decide you're going to interview everybody. That would be a census. A sampling is when you have a larger population and you can't talk to everybody, and so you have some sort of a procedure to do a random sample. And so maybe you have 30 people in the division. You're not going to interview 30 people, but you randomly select 10 of the 30, and then you can do the interviews. You do want to be able to help the interviewees understand that there can be that their responses can be summarized and used, and perhaps you might even use quotes. But again, coming back to anonymity, you want to make sure that they understand that you will keep their identities secret and anonymous. As I mentioned for a minute, focus groups are similar to interviews. You still have to talk about confidentiality and anonymity. Just like interviews, you want to have a guide for the focus group where you have the questions and the process, the instructions. You want to have a facilitator and a scribe. You want to look for diversity generally within a focus group. Sometimes you'll have a homogeneous focus group where everyone's very similar in their background or their role or their position and in the organization, but other times you want a more heterogeneous type of a group where there's a lot of variety. Watch for less vocal participants. So one dynamic you'll see often in focus groups is you'll have kind of the outspoken person who talks more than others. That's fine, but you need one of the roles of the facilitator is to try to get the others to also share. And if someone is less vocal, you have to actually call on them and ask for their input. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to do an audio or video recording usually, so you can go back and refer to that and not just rely on your notes. Surveys combine really well with focus groups before or after. Or interviews before or after. But surveys, you can create your questions just like with interviewing or focus groups. You got to figure out who you're gonna survey. Is it a census survey? You're sending it to everyone in the area, or are you going to do a sample? If it's a big organization of 1,000 employees, you're not going to survey 1,000 employees, but maybe you'll send it out to a sample of 100 of them. So you need to think about that. And generally, we want to have random sampling. In a survey, you're going to have anonymity of respondents, and you need to make sure that that's communicated to them. Writing good survey questions can be difficult, so you need to be very careful in the wording of your questions, and you also want to test your questions on just people. You can a spouse, a partner, friends, family, coworkers, people on your team. Run the questions by them and just say, does this make sense? Do people respond in the way you would anticipate them responding? And if not, then there might be a problem with your question. You want to think about statistical accuracy. Especially with survey quantitative data from a survey, you can't overdo it in terms of how you present that to the client, because most clients don't have a great high level of quantitative literacy or statistical understanding. And so a lot of times you're really going to be doing things like comparative summary statistics, like mean scores, distributions, things like that. If you do something that's more of a regression or a more inferential statistic type approach, you'll really have to work hard on making sure it's communicated in a way that the client can really understand it. We talked a little bit about sampling, population or census versus a random sample. The sample size depends on the size of the group, and it depends on the types of analyses and the statistics that you want to run. So if you have questions about that within your own project and what you plan to do this semester, please let me know and I can kind of talk to you about that and walk you through that. There's very specific processes for sampling. You can do random sampling, convenient sampling. Generally speaking, though, you want to do random sampling whenever possible, because that means you can generalize the results. We can also do observations, where you just go and you're the fly on the wall. You need to decide, are you going to share your role and purpose there, or are you just going to try to be incognito? You're sharing with the colleague to avoid bias or use 2 or more observers. You have to think about the amount of detail and note-taking, and sometimes you can have video or audio that you can then refer back to later. And then unobtrusive measures, that's historical data, official documents, web chats, discussion boards, databases, physical environment, language. There's often a lot of existing data that it's already there that you can use for your OD engagement, and getting the access to that can be really helpful. Sometimes the unobtrusive measures can contradict or substantiate and validate information obtained through your other means. And so I think the general idea here with all of these different types of approaches to data collection is that you want to triangulate your findings. So you want to have perhaps different approaches. So use some unobtrusive measures, maybe do some observation, do a survey, do some interviews, do multiple things so you have like a 3-legged stool where you can say, I'm consistently seeing these issues arise, and you can communicate that back to the client. That's much more convincing than saying, I just did a survey and this is what I found. But you can say, and I looked at your existing documents and this is what I found, and I did interviews and this is what I found. That can be really helpful. Ultimately, and we'll end with this, it's choosing the right strategy can be difficult. How do you choose what to do? Ultimately, each approach takes time and money. You have to think about access, and will the client give you access? You have to think about relevance, accuracy, and flexibility. Ultimately, you want to select the method that fits with the time available, the motivation of the client, and the severity of the problems. Don't overinvest, but be thorough. Don't underinvest. And I think data collection is really key to having good OT intervention. And so I wish you all luck as you continue with your projects. Thank you.